The dust of the trail clung to Grace Holloway's skin like a second layer as the stagecoach rattled across the unforgiving terrain of Wyoming territory in the summer of 1875. Every bump sent a jolt of anxiety through her body, reminding her that with each passing mile, she was drawing closer to a future she had never imagined for herself, becoming the wife of a man she had never met. Grace clutched the worn photograph in her gloved hand, the edges softened from countless examinations during the long journey from Philadelphia. The stern face of Mr. Horace Wilkins, successful cattle rancher of Timber Creek, stared back at her, a stranger who had paid for her passage west after responding to her advertisement in the matrimonial news. A business arrangement, pure and simple. She was to be his wife, to cook his meals, tend his home, and bear his children. In exchange, she would have security, a roof over her head, an escape from the crushing poverty that had threatened to consume her after her parents' deaths. Nearly there, miss, the driver called down. Timber Creek just beyond that ridge. Grace tucked the photograph into her reticule and smoothed her travel-worn blue dress, wishing for the 100th time that she could have arrived looking more presentable. First impressions mattered, especially when meeting one's future husband. Her heart pounded so fiercely she feared it might burst through her ribs. The stagecoach crested the ridge, and the modest settlement of Timber Creek spread before them, a dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, the spire of a small church rising against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains. It was both larger and smaller than she had imagined, intimidating in its foreignness yet underwhelming after her life in Philadelphia. When the coach finally lurched to a stop outside the town's only hotel, Grace gathered her courage along with her meager belongings. The driver opened the door and offered his weathered hand to help her down. "Thank you," she murmured, her legs unsteady after days of travel. A small crowd had gathered, curious about the new arrival. Grace scanned their faces, wondering which might be Mr. Wilkins, but none matched the photograph. "Miss Holloway?" Grace turned toward the voice. A tall man in a dark suit approached, his expression businesslike. "I'm Samuel Parker, Mr. Wilkins' solicitor. He sends his regrets that he couldn't meet you personally. Urgent business at the ranch." The man barely made eye contact as he consulted a pocket watch. "I'll arrange your room for tonight. The wedding is set for tomorrow afternoon." Grace felt her stomach drop. Tomorrow? So soon? Mr. Wilkins is an efficient man who sees no reason for delay. He's arranged everything with Reverend Collins. Before Grace could respond, a commotion erupted down the street. A rider approached at a gallop, pulling his horse to a dramatic halt that sent dust billowing around them. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his movements speaking of a lifetime in the saddle. "Parker," the newcomer called, striding toward them with purpose. "Heard the stage was coming in today." Grace couldn't help but stare. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in practical trail clothes, worn denim, boots covered in dust, and a dark Stetson that shadowed eyes as blue as a mountain lake. Unlike the stiff, formal photograph of Mr. Wilkins, this man radiated life and energy. "Kingston," Parker acknowledged stiffly. "This doesn't concern you." The cowboy Kingston turned his attention to Grace, and his expression softened. "You must be Miss Holloway." He removed his hat, revealing tousled dark hair. "Kingston Reed. Most folks just call me Kit." "Grace Holloway," she replied, extending her hand automatically. When he took it, his calloused palm warm against hers, something fluttered in her chest. "Miss Holloway is tired from her journey," Parker interrupted. "And she has preparations to make for tomorrow." Kit's eyes narrowed. "So Wilkins is going through with this?" "Mr. Wilkins' arrangements with Miss Holloway are none of your business," Parker said coldly. "Maybe not." Kit turned back to Grace. "But someone ought to tell the lady that she has options." "Mr. Reed," Parker began, but Kit continued as if he hadn't spoken. "Miss Holloway," he said directly to Grace, "you don't have to marry a stranger. Not Wilkins, not anyone. Timber Creek might be small, but we look after our own. If you need time, or a way home, or a different situation altogether, there are those who would help." Grace stared at him, bewildered by this unexpected intervention. I don't understand. What Mr. Reed fails to mention," Parker said sharply, "is his personal grudge against Mr. Wilkins. He would sabotage any arrangement my client makes." Kit's jaw tightened. "This isn't about Wilkins and me. It's about a lady being rushed into something without knowing what or who she's getting into." Grace looked between the two men, confused and overwhelmed. After weeks of travel and uncertainty, this confrontation was the last thing she needed. "Mr. Parker," she said finally, summoning what remained of her composure, "I would appreciate being shown to my room now. I am indeed tired from my journey." Parker looked relieved. "Of course, Miss Holloway. Right this way." As she turned to follow him, Kit stepped closer. "Miss Holloway," he said quietly, "Wilkins isn't what he seems. Before you say any vows, at least let me tell you what kind of man he truly is." Their eyes met, and something in his earnest expression made her hesitate. "Mr. Reed, I appreciate your concern, but I've made arrangements that I intend to honor." "Arrangements can be changed," he said. "Just think about it. I'll be at Sullivan's livery if you want to talk." Parker cleared his throat impatiently, and Grace turned away from Kit's intense gaze. As she followed Parker toward the hotel, she could feel Kit watching her, and despite herself, she found she was already thinking about his words. The hotel room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and window overlooking the main street. After Parker left with a reminder about tomorrow's schedule, Grace sank onto the bed, her mind spinning. She unpacked her few belongings, including the letters from Mr. Wilkins' formal, businesslike correspondences outlining his expectations and the terms of their arrangement. Nothing romantic, nothing personal, just a transaction. She had told herself it was enough. Security, stability, a chance at a new life away from the creditors and painful memories that haunted her in Philadelphia. But Kit Reed's words echoed in her mind. "You don't have to marry a stranger." What did he know about Mr. Wilkins that would prompt such a warning? And why should she trust a man she had just met over the arrangements she had spent months making? Grace moved to the window, watching as people moved along the dusty street. Her gaze drifted to Sullivan's livery, visible at the far end of town. Kit Reed had offered information at the very least. Surely it wouldn't hurt to hear what he had to say before tomorrow. Decision made, Grace quickly refreshed herself, changed into her second dress, a modest green cotton that had fared better during travel, and slipped out of the hotel. Timber Creek was bustling with afternoon activity. Grace made her way down the boardwalk, nodding politely to curious onlookers. Everyone seemed to know who she was, their gazes following her progress with undisguised interest. Sullivan's livery was a large wooden structure with the smell of hay and horses drifting from its open doors. A young boy was sweeping the entrance. "Excuse me," Grace said. "I'm looking for Mr. Reed." The boy grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. "Kit's in the back paddock, madam, working with that new Mustang." Grace followed his pointing finger around the side of the building to a fenced enclosure where a magnificent black horse was trotting in circles. Kit stood in the center, guiding the animal with subtle movements of a long rope. She watched, momentarily transfixed. Kit moved with confident grace, his attention completely focused on the horse. There was a gentleness to his method that contrasted with his powerful build. The horse suddenly stopped, nostrils flaring as it noticed Grace. Kit turned, and a slow smile spread across his face when he saw her. "Miss Holloway," he called, coiling the rope as he walked toward the fence. "Wasn't sure I'd see you before tomorrow. I thought it prudent to hear what you have to say, Mr. Reed," she replied, keeping her voice level despite her racing pulse. "Though I'm not convinced it will change anything." Kit's expression sobered. "Fair enough." He glanced around. "This isn't the place, though. Too many ears. Would you allow me to take you somewhere we can talk privately?" Grace hesitated. Going somewhere alone with a man she barely knew wasn't proper, but neither was her entire situation. "I give you my word as a gentleman," Kit added, noticing her uncertainty. "Just a conversation where we won't be overheard or interrupted." "Very well," she agreed, realizing she had already come this far. Kit efficiently settled the horse, exchanged a few words with the livery owner, and returned to Grace with 2 saddled horses. "Can you ride, Miss Holloway?" Grace nodded. "Though it's been some time. Daisy here is gentle as they come," he said, helping her mount a dappled mare. "We won't go far." They rode out of town, following a well-worn trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. The beauty of the landscape momentarily distracted Grace from her anxieties. "It's different from Philadelphia," she commented. Kit glanced at her. "That where you're from?" "Yes. This is my first time west of the Mississippi." "It grows on you," he said. "Takes some getting used to. But there's freedom here you won't find back east." They reached a small clearing beside a stream and dismounted. Kit tethered the horses where they could drink and gestured to a fallen log. "This should be private enough," he said. Grace sat, arranging her skirts. "Mr. Reed, I'd appreciate if you would speak plainly. What do you know about Mr. Wilkins that concerns you so?" Kit remained standing, turning his hat in his hands. "Horace Wilkins came to Timber Creek about 5 years ago. Bought the old Patterson Ranch and built it into one of the biggest spreads in the territory. He's respected for his business sense, keeps to himself mostly." "That hardly sounds concerning," Grace noted. "I'm getting there," Kit said. "What folks around here don't talk about is how he treats those who work for him, or how he deals with those who cross him. I worked at the Wilkins Ranch for a spell when I first came to these parts. And he's a hard man, Miss Holloway, cruel when it suits him. His last foreman disappeared after a disagreement over cattle sales. The man before that left with broken ribs and no pay after questioning Wilkins' orders." Grace frowned. "Those are serious accusations. There's more. This isn't the first time he's arranged for a bride. There was a woman 2 years ago, came from Chicago. Lasted 3 months before she fled in the night. No one knows where she went, but the bruises on her face when she was last seen in town told their own story." Grace felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. "How do I know you're telling the truth? Mr. Parker suggested you have personal reasons to dislike Mr. Wilkins." Kit's expression darkened. "Parker wasn't wrong about that. Wilkins and I have history. My sister worked as a housekeeper at his ranch. He paused, his knuckles white where he gripped his hat. She caught his eye. When she refused his advances, he made sure no one in town would hire her. Said she'd stolen from him. She had to leave Timber Creek, start over somewhere else where his influence couldn't reach." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. "That's terrible if true. But it still could be a misunderstanding or—" "No misunderstanding, Miss Holloway," Kit interrupted. "I've seen the kind of man Horace Wilkins is, and I couldn't stand by and watch another woman walk into his house without at least trying to warn her." Grace looked down at her hands, troubled. "Even if what you say is true, what choice do I have? I spent nearly everything I had on the journey here. I have no family to return to, no prospects in Philadelphia." Kit sat beside her on the log, keeping a respectful distance. "There are always choices. Timber Creek needs a schoolteacher. The town would provide housing. Or Mrs. Sullivan at the hotel needs help managing the place. Her arthritis is getting worse. If you wanted to return east, I'd personally make sure you had the means. Why would you do that for a stranger? Grace asked, searching his face. Because no one did it for my sister, he said simply. Or for Wilkins' last bride. They sat in silence for a moment, the stream bubbling nearby, birds calling in the trees. What will happen if I don't show up tomorrow? Grace finally asked. Wilkins will be angry, but he can hardly force you to marry him. He paid for my passage. I owe him a debt that can be repaid in dollars. Not with your life, Kit said firmly. Grace stood, needing to move as her thoughts raced. This is overwhelming. I came west prepared to build a life with Mr. Wilkins. I never expected. I know, Kit said gently, and I'm sorry to upend your plans. But I believe you deserve to know what you're walking into. I need time to think, Grace said. Time is something I can give you, Kit replied, standing. But Wilkins expects a wedding tomorrow. Then I need to make my decision before then. Grace smoothed her skirts, trying to gather her composure. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Reed. Kit, he reminded her with a small smile. And you're welcome, Miss Holloway. Grace, she offered in return. They rode back to town in companionable silence, each lost in thought. When they reached the livery, Kit helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Whatever you decide, he said quietly. Know that you're not alone here. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Grace felt a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Then she stepped back, nodding formally. Good day, Mr. Reed. Good day, Miss Holloway. As Grace walked back to the hotel, her mind was in turmoil. Kit's warnings echoed in her thoughts, alongside her own fears and hopes. By the time she reached her room, she knew what she had to do. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Grace had barely slept, but a strange calm had settled over her. She dressed carefully in her best gown, a pale blue silk that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her smaller frame. When Parker knocked on her door at precisely 10 o'clock, she was ready. Miss Holloway, he greeted her, eyes appraising her appearance. You look lovely. Mr. Wilkins will be pleased. Mr. Parker, Grace replied steadily. I need to speak with Mr. Wilkins before the ceremony. Parker frowned. That's highly irregular. The wedding is set for noon, nevertheless. I insist on speaking with him first. Privately. Something in her tone must have convinced him of her determination. Very well. He's arriving in town shortly. I'll arrange it. An hour later, Grace sat in a private parlor at the hotel, hands folded in her lap, as the door opened to admit a tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit. Horace Wilkins was perhaps 50, his hair steel gray, his face lined with years and sun. In person, he looked even more formidable than in his photograph. Miss Holloway, he said, his voice deep and controlled. I understand you wish to speak with me. Grace rose and met his gaze directly. Yes, Mr. Wilkins. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. He gestured for her to sit, then took a chair opposite her. Is there a problem? Not a problem exactly, Grace began carefully, but I have concerns that I feel must be addressed before we proceed. Wilkins' expression remained impassive. Go on. I've heard certain things about your reputation in Timber Creek, about how you treat those who work for you, about a previous bride. A muscle twitched in Wilkins' jaw. Reed, he said flatly. He's been filling your head with lies. Are they lies, Mr. Wilkins? Reed has a personal vendetta against me. His sister was caught stealing silver from my home. When confronted, she made false accusations to deflect blame. And the woman from Chicago? Wilkins sighed heavily. My first attempt at marriage after my wife's death was unsuccessful. Mrs. Chambers found ranch life too difficult and left of her own accord. The bruises Reed likely mentioned came from a fall from a horse. She was inexperienced and insisted on riding alone despite my warnings. His explanations sounded reasonable, yet something in his eyes, a coldness, a calculation, made Grace uneasy. I see, she said non-committally. Mr. Wilkins, I came west in good faith, seeking a partnership of mutual benefit. But I need to be certain that partnership includes respect. Of course, he replied smoothly. I'm offering you a position as mistress of a successful ranch, financial security, and my name. In return, I expect loyalty, proper behavior, and the fulfillment of household duties. It's a fair arrangement. And if I were to change my mind, Wilkins' expression hardened. That would be disappointing. I've gone to considerable expense and trouble. The community expects this wedding. It would be embarrassing for us both if you were to back out now. There was a threat beneath his words, subtle but unmistakable. I appreciate your candor, Grace said, rising. I will see you at the church at noon, Mr. Wilkins. He stood as well, towering over her. I'm glad we understand each other, Miss Holloway. After he left, Grace remained standing in the center of the room, heart pounding. His explanations were plausible, but his manner had confirmed her worst fears. The way his gaze had assessed her, like property he was about to acquire, had chilled her to the bone. She had less than an hour to decide her fate. Grace returned to her room, gathering her few possessions and placing them carefully in her trunk. Her movements were methodical, hiding the turmoil within. At precisely 11:45, a knock came at her door. Miss Holloway? Parker called. The carriage is waiting. Grace took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and opened the door. Mr. Parker, would you be so kind as to deliver a message to Mr. Wilkins? Parker blinked in surprise. You're not coming? Please inform Mr. Wilkins that I am grateful for his arrangement of my passage, but I cannot in good conscience proceed with our marriage. I will repay his expenses as soon as I am able. Miss Holloway, this is most irregular. Furthermore, she continued firmly, please have my trunk delivered to Sullivan's livery. I've accepted alternative employment in town. Parker's face reddened. Wilkins won't take this lightly. He's not a man who tolerates public embarrassment. I understand the risk, Grace replied. Good day, Mr. Parker. She closed the door before he could respond, leaning against it as her heart raced. She had done it, taken her fate into her own hands for perhaps the first time in her life. The feeling was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Grace waited until she was certain Parker had left, then slipped out of the hotel by the back stairs. The town was quiet, most residents either at their midday meal or gathering at the church for the wedding that wouldn't happen. Sullivan's livery was cool and dim after the bright sunlight. Kit was inside, brushing down a chestnut gelding. He looked up when she entered, surprise and then something warmer lighting his eyes. Grace, he said, setting aside the brush. I thought you'd be at the church by now. I declined Mr. Wilkins' offer, she said simply. Kit's expression was a mixture of relief and concern. He won't take that well, so I've been told, Mr. Parker seemed quite certain I'd regret my decision. Are you certain you don't? Kit asked quietly. Grace considered the question seriously. I'm certain I would have regretted the alternative more. When I met with Mr. Wilkins this morning, I saw something in him, a hardness, cruelty perhaps. You were right to warn me. Kit nodded. What will you do now? I told Mr. Parker I found alternative employment in town, though that was perhaps presumptuous of me. I was hoping your suggestion about the school or the hotel might still be valid. More than valid, Kit assured her. Mrs. Sullivan would hire you in a heartbeat. She's been complaining about needing help for months. And the town council has been searching for a teacher since Miss Abernathy left last winter. Grace smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Then it seems I have options after all. You do, Kit confirmed. Though you should know Wilkins isn't likely to let this go easily. He's a proud man, and he doesn't like losing. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Reed, Grace said with more confidence than she felt. And I've faced difficult men before. Kit's expression softened. I believe you are, Miss Holloway, and you won't be facing him alone. The church bells rang in the distance, signaling noon. Grace imagined the scene there, Wilkins waiting impatiently, the townspeople whispering as Parker delivered her message. She shivered despite the warm day. I've asked for my trunk to be delivered here, she said. I hope that's all right. Of course. You're welcome to stay at my sister's old cabin until you get settled. It's small, but it's private and not far from town. That's very kind, but I couldn't impose. It's no imposition, Kit insisted. The place has been sitting empty since she left. Might as well be used. Before Grace could respond, the livery doors burst open. Horace Wilkins stood there, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, Parker hovering anxiously behind him. So this is where you've hidden yourself? Wilkins said coldly, his gaze moving between Grace and Kit. I should have known Reed would be behind this humiliation. Kit stepped slightly in front of Grace. Miss Holloway made her own decision, Wilkins. After you poisoned her mind with your lies, Wilkins snapped. He turned to Grace. You've made a foolish choice, Miss Holloway. One you'll regret. Grace straightened her spine. I don't believe I will, Mr. Wilkins. I appreciate your arrangement of my passage west, and I intend to repay you in full. But I cannot and will not marry you. You signed a contract, Wilkins said. I have the legal right to be repaid for expenses incurred. Grace interrupted. Nothing more. I did not sign away my freedom or my right to choose. Wilkins' eyes narrowed dangerously. Reed has obviously convinced you he's a better option. I wonder if he told you about his history. The accusations of cattle rustling in Colorado. The gambling debts in Cheyenne. Kit's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained steady. My past isn't perfect, Wilkins. Difference is, I don't hide it. Miss Holloway, Wilkins said, ignoring Kit. I'm willing to overlook this momentary confusion. Come with me now, and we can still salvage the situation. No, Mr. Wilkins, Grace said firmly. My decision is final. Wilkins' face darkened. You'll regret this. Both of you. He turned on his heel and stalked out, Parker scurrying after him. Grace released a shaky breath once they were gone. He's more dangerous than I realized. He is, Kit agreed grimly. But he's not all-powerful, despite what he thinks. He looked at her with concern. Are you all right? Yes, Grace said, surprised to find it was true. Despite the confrontation, she felt lighter than she had in months. Actually, I'm better than all right. For the first time since my parents died, I feel like I'm making my own choices instead of simply reacting to circumstances. Kit smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. Freedom suits you, Miss Holloway. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. True to Kit's word, Mrs. Sullivan eagerly hired Grace to help manage the hotel, providing a small room as part of her compensation. Grace settled into a routine, learning the business and gradually meeting the townspeople, many of whom were surprisingly supportive of her decision not to marry Wilkins. Never did think you'd be a good match for old Horace, Mrs. Sullivan confided as they sorted linens one afternoon. Too much spirit in you. He likes his women quiet and obedient, like that poor creature from Chicago. You knew her? Grace asked. Emma Chambers. Sweet girl, completely unprepared for Wilkins or ranch life. Used to watch her come into town for supplies, jumpy as a rabbit around hunting dogs. When she disappeared, most folks figured she'd run back east. But the older woman shook her head. Just glad you had more sense than to get trapped out there. Kit visited the hotel regularly, often bringing news or simply checking on Grace's welfare. Their friendship grew naturally, conversations flowing easily between them. Grace learned that Kit had come west after the war between the states, working his way through ranches in Colorado and Wyoming before settling in Timber Creek 3 years ago. My sister Kathleen joined me about a year later, he explained as they walked along the creek one Sunday afternoon. She was widowed young, her husband died at Gettysburg and needed a fresh start. Things were good until she took that position at Wilkins Ranch. Where is she now? Grace asked. Denver, working as a companion to a judge's wife. She writes regularly. His expression softened. She'd like you. Grace felt a warm glow at his words. I'd like to meet her someday. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that were growing beyond friendship. Kit reached for her hand, his touch gentle. Grace, a gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet splintering the tree beside them. Kit reacted instantly, pulling Grace to the ground behind a fallen log. Are you hit? He demanded, scanning her for injuries. No, she gasped, heart pounding. What? Stay down. Kit cautiously raised his head, surveying the surrounding woods. Whoever it was is probably gone, but we need to get back to town. They made their way carefully through the trees, Kit keeping Grace behind him, alert for any movement. When they reached town, they went directly to Sheriff Morgan's office. The grizzled lawman listened to their account with a deepening frown. Can't prove it was aimed at you specifically, he said finally. Could have been a hunter with poor aim. A mile from town, with a shot that close? Kit challenged. That was deliberate, Sheriff. Even if it was, can't prove who pulled the trigger. Morgan sighed. I'll keep an eye out, but without evidence. We know who's behind this, Kit said flatly. Morgan's expression hardened. Accusations without proof are dangerous. Reed. Especially against a man like Wilkins. So we just wait until he succeeds in hurting Miss Holloway? I didn't say that, Morgan replied. Be careful. Both of you. Watch your backs. And if anything else happens, come straight to me. As they left the sheriff's office, Grace was shaken but resolute. He doesn't believe us. He believes us, Kit corrected. He just can't act officially without proof. But he's a good man, he'll be watching. Over the next few weeks, a series of incidents rattled Grace's newfound security. The hotel's water barrel was found contaminated with kerosene. A threatening note appeared under her door. One night, she woke to the smell of smoke, only to discover a small fire had been set at the hotel's back, entrance quickly extinguished. But the message was clear. Sheriff Morgan investigated each incident, but with no witnesses and no direct evidence linking them to Wilkins, his hands were tied. He's trying to frighten you into leaving, Kit said grimly after the fire. Or worse, into running back to him. I won't, Grace said firmly, though fear had become her constant companion. I won't let him win. Kit ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. I should never have brought you into this. My quarrel with Wilkins has put you in danger. You didn't bring me into anything, Grace countered. I made my own choice, and I'd make it again. Their gazes locked, and Kit stepped closer, one hand gently touching her cheek. Grace, he said softly, I need you to know something. When I first saw you step off that stage, I didn't intervene just because of Wilkins. There was something about you, something that made me want to know you better. Grace's heart quickened. I felt it too, she admitted. Even then, when I was still determined to go through with the wedding, I felt drawn to you. Kit leaned forward, hesitating just before his lips met hers, giving her the chance to pull away. Instead, Grace closed the distance between them. Her first kiss filled with a sweetness she had never expected to find in this harsh territory. When they parted, Kit's eyes were dark with emotion. I'll find a way to end this, he promised, so we can have a chance without Wilkins' shadow hanging over us. That chance came sooner than expected. The next day, a stranger arrived in Timber Creek, a small, neatly dressed man who introduced himself as Edward Pinkerton of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I'm investigating the disappearance of Mrs. Emma Chambers, he explained to the sheriff. Kit and Grace gathered in Morgan's office. Her brother in Chicago hired our agency after nearly 2 years without word from his sister. Wilkins claimed she returned east, Sheriff Morgan said. So I've heard, Pinkerton replied. But she never arrived in Chicago. No stagecoach or train record of her passage. No sightings along the way. It's as if she vanished between here and there. Because she did, Kit said grimly. Pinkerton nodded. I've been quietly investigating Wilkins for 3 weeks. His ranch hands are too afraid to talk, but his former cook was more forthcoming once I tracked her to Laramie. She witnessed Wilkins beating Mrs. Chambers on multiple occasions. The last time she saw Mrs. Chambers, the woman could barely walk from her injuries. Sheriff Morgan's expression had grown increasingly troubled. That's still not proof of murder, Mr. Pinkerton. No, but it was enough to convince a judge to issue this. Pinkerton produced an official document. A warrant to search Wilkins' property. I'd like your assistance, Sheriff. Morgan read the warrant carefully, then nodded. When do you want to proceed? Immediately, before word can reach Wilkins. The sheriff turned to Kit. Reed, I'll need deputies. You interested? Kit glanced at Grace, concern evident in his eyes. Go, she urged. This might be the only chance to find justice for Emma Chambers, and to end Wilkins' threats. Mrs. Sullivan and I will look after Miss Holloway, Pinkerton assured him. I've arranged for one of my associates to remain in town. Within the hour, Sheriff Morgan, Kit, Pinkerton, and 4 deputized townsmen rode out toward the Wilkins ranch. Grace watched them go, a prayer on her lips for their safe return. The hours of waiting were interminable. Grace tried to focus on her work at the hotel, but her thoughts kept returning to Kit and the confrontation happening at the ranch. What if Wilkins resisted? What if someone was hurt or worse? It was nearly midnight when hoofbeats announced their return. Grace rushed outside to see a grim procession. Sheriff Morgan and Kit rode at the front, followed by the deputies. Behind them came a wagon bearing a tarp-covered shape that could only be a body, and at the rear Horace Wilkins himself, hands bound, face dark with rage. The town quickly gathered as Wilkins was led to the jail. Kit broke away from the group and strode to Grace, gathering her in a fierce embrace. It's over, he murmured against her hair. We found her. Emma Chambers? Grace whispered, pulling back to see his face. Kit nodded grimly. Buried behind the old barn. Pinkerton had information from the cook about where to look. Once we started digging, Wilkins tried to run. When that failed, he tried to shoot his way out. No one was seriously hurt, he added quickly, seeing her expression. And Wilkins will hang for what he did. True to Kit's word, justice moved swiftly. The evidence was irrefutable, and witnesses came forward once Wilkins was safely behind bars. 3 weeks after the discovery of Emma Chambers' body, Horace Wilkins was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. The night after the verdict, Kit invited Grace to dinner at the small house he'd been building on the edge of town. "It's not much yet," he said apologetically as he showed her around the two-room structure. "But I've been working on it whenever I could spare time from the livery." "It's wonderful," Grace said sincerely, admiring the solid construction and careful details. "You've done all this yourself?" "Most of it. Some of the men in town helped with the roof raising." Kit seemed nervous, running a hand through his hair. "Grace, there's something I want to ask you." Her heart quickened as he took her hands in his. "These past months, getting to know you, seeing your strength and courage, I've fallen in love with you," he said simply. "I know it's soon, and after everything with Wilkins, I'd understand if you wanted to wait. But I wanted you to know how I feel, and that whenever you're ready, I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming my wife." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "Kit Reed, are you proposing to me?" "Not very well, apparently," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "I should have gotten down on one knee." "No," Grace interrupted, squeezing his hands. "It's perfect. And yes, I will marry you. Not because I need security or protection, but because I love you too." Kit's face lit with joy, and he pulled her into his arms. His kiss filled with promise and tenderness. They were married 2 weeks later in the same church where Grace had been meant to wed Wilkins. The irony wasn't lost on the townspeople, who turned out in force to witness the union. Mrs. Sullivan had insisted on hosting the celebration at the hotel, and the entire town seemed determined to make the day special. "Never seen such a turnout for a wedding," Sheriff Morgan commented as he congratulated them. "Folks are happy to see you both get a fresh start." That night, alone in the small house that would be their home, Grace and Kit spoke of the future they would build together. "I never expected this when I came west," Grace admitted as they sat before the fireplace. "I thought I was sacrificing the chance for love in exchange for security. And I never expected to find you," Kit replied, his arm around her shoulders. "After what happened with my sister, I was focused on bringing Wilkins to justice. I didn't think beyond that." "Life has a way of surprising us," Grace said, leaning against him. "My father used to say that the best things in life are rarely planned." "Smart man," Kit murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I wish I could have known him." "He would have liked you," Grace said confidently. "He valued honesty and courage above all else." As autumn turned to winter, Grace and Kit settled into married life. Grace continued working at the hotel, while also taking on the position of town schoolteacher 3 days a week. Kit expanded his business at the livery, purchasing Sullivan's share when the older man decided to retire. The little house grew along with their dreams. Kit added a kitchen extension before the first snow, and they planned a second bedroom for the spring. "Planning ahead?" Mrs. Sullivan teased when Grace mentioned the addition. Grace blushed. "It seems wise to be prepared." The older woman patted her hand knowingly. "Best kind of preparation there is." By the time the mountain passes cleared in late spring, Grace's condition was becoming evident. Kit was elated, hovering protectively while simultaneously encouraging her independence, a balance that made Grace love him all the more. "I've been thinking," Kit said one evening as they sat on their small porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "About names." Grace smiled, her hand resting on her growing belly. "Have you now? If it's a boy, I thought maybe after your father? You've spoken so fondly of him." "James," Grace said softly. "James Kingston Reed. I like the sound of that." "And if it's a girl?" Kit asked. Grace considered. "What about Kathleen after your sister?" Kit's eyes brightened. "She'd be honored, though she'd insist on visiting immediately to spoil her namesake." "I'd welcome that," Grace said. "Family should be together when possible." Kit covered her hand with his. We're building something good here, aren't we? Something that will last. We are, Grace agreed, leaning against his shoulder. Something I never thought I'd find when I agreed to be a mail-order bride. I'm glad you had the courage to choose your own path, Kit said, even when it was the harder one. The harder path led me to you, Grace replied simply. I'd choose it again without hesitation. When summer came again to the Wyoming territory, so did their daughter. Kathleen Grace Reed arrived on a warm June morning, with her mother's golden hair and her father's blue eyes. A week after the birth, as Grace sat in the rocking chair Kit had crafted, nursing their infant daughter, a letter arrived from Denver. Kit read it aloud, his voice filled with excitement. Kathleen's coming to visit, he announced. Says she wouldn't miss meeting her niece for anything in the world. When will she arrive? Grace asked, smiling at his enthusiasm. 2 weeks, if the stage runs on schedule. Kit knelt beside the rocking chair, gently touching their daughter's tiny hand. Our family is growing. In more ways than one, Grace agreed. Sheriff Morgan mentioned yesterday that the town council is considering your proposal for expanding the livery into a proper stable and horse breeding operation. They are, Kit confirmed. With more settlers coming through each month, there's demand for good stock. Could mean a solid future for us, for all 3 of us. 4, Grace corrected with a smile. Don't forget your sister. For today, Kit agreed. And maybe more in the years to come? Grace leaned forward to kiss him softly. I think that's a wonderful plan, Mr. Reed. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and their daughter slept peacefully in her cradle, Grace stood with Kit on their porch, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out? She asked. If you hadn't been there when I arrived, if you hadn't spoken up. Sometimes, Kit admitted. But then I remember something my father told me once. He said true love isn't found in comfort or convenience. It's found in courage, the courage to speak the truth, to take chances, to trust another person with your heart. Your father was a wise man too, Grace said, turning in his arms to face him. He would have adored you, Kit assured her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Almost as much as I do. I love you, Kingston Reed, Grace said softly. Thank you for telling me I didn't have to marry a stranger. Kit smiled, his eyes reflecting the last golden light of day. Thank you for being brave enough to believe me. Their lips met as the first stars appeared above the Wyoming mountains, their kiss a promise of all the days and years to come, days built not on obligation or necessity, but on choice, courage, and love freely given. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere on the edge of town, a new family of settlers was making camp for the night, drawn west by the promise of opportunity and a fresh start. The same promise that had brought Grace to Timber Creek, though she had found so much more than she had ever dared to hope. As they went inside to their sleeping daughter, Grace knew with absolute certainty that this man, this home, this life was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because fate or circumstance had decreed it, but because she had found the courage to choose it for herself.